Hello, welcome back to Beyond Networks, the evolution of living systems. We've come a long way in this course. And so the basic take-home message is that there are really deep philosophical, scientific questions that relate to the organization of living systems and their evolution. And in the last two lectures, we sort of looked a bit more historically at evolutionary biology. We looked at the modern synthesis in evolution, a sort of a historical narrative and trend that tried to focus evolution at the genetic level. And then the various sort of models that came out of Evo-Devo, which contribute to the integration, hopefully, of development, the rejoining of development and inheritance and natural selection. These sort of models are a very diverse bunch and unfortunately mostly verbally and qualitatively formulated. So today we're going to look at another sort of new trend in evolutionary biology. This movement, which is calling, I would say, for an extended evolutionary synthesis, or the EES. I will use this abbreviation in this talk. And it's sort of a movement that started with two papers that came out within a few months of each other in 2007, authored by Massimo Pigliucci and Gerd Müller, which resulted in a workshop at the KLI in Klosterneuburg near Vienna, and in 2010, a book edited by Pigliucci and Müller that collected a few essays, not all in favor of an extension, but some of them arguing that we need to extend the evolutionary synthesis. And usually they're accompanied by diagrams that look a bit like this, where the traditional core of evolutionary theory is in the center here, depicted with three sort of words that represent almost Lewontin's principles, but not quite, but precision has never been a big deal in this field, and a bunch of other things like mutation, Mendelian inheritance, population genetics, contingency, speciation, and trends, which are sort of uncontroversially part of traditional evolutionary biology. Added on to that are a bunch of other topics here that constitute or are supposed to constitute this new extended synthesis. Typically, they are, sort of organized around the big four, which are developmental plasticity and phenotypic accommodation, niche construction, which we've encountered already as an example in this course, non-genetic epigenetic inheritance, and Evo-Devo and evolvability, which I think should go together. The sort of a question of the source of variation and biases in variation that we were looking at in the last lecture. And so the claim here is that an extended evolutionary synthesis would provide mechanistic causal explanation for phenotypic evolution. So let's explore a little bit what is meant by this claim. Over the following year, debate ensued, and so the sort of concepts of what this extended synthesis includes were refined. Here is a beautiful diagram that I took from this picture, from this paper by two philosophers, Fabregas, Tejeda, and Vergara Silva, in 2018, which is sort of a colorful version of a diagram first published by Massimo Pigliucci in 2009. And it depicts the core, natural selection, common descent, and then various fields of investigation. Natural history is a little curious. Paleontology, Mendelianism, population, statistical genetics. So this is the core here, and then a sort of spiraling out genomics, networks theory, multi-level selection, complexity theory, epigenetic, inheritance, genetic accommodation, ecology, niche construction, phenotypic plasticity, modularity, evolvability, Evo-Devo, and so forth, spiraling out into an open future. These are all very interesting sort of areas of study or questions. I use niche construction. As you know, I'm really big into evolvability and modularity, and these are all very interesting topics, complexity theory. So how do they connect? And what is this sort of diagram supposed to tell us? And how, what are we extending? How are we extending it? These are sort of the debates that surround this extended synthesis movement. And it picked up speed and caught on really quickly, culminating in a sort of a debate in Nature, an interesting sort of split paper in 2014, where there were two sort of sides to the paper. The left-hand side, the author said, yes, we urgently need a revision or a replacement for the existing modern synthesis theory of evolution, and a counterpoint of people who said, no, all is well, okay? So it's kind of mirroring the debate a few years earlier about regulatory evolution that we were talking about last time, really high sort of profile headlines, et cetera, et cetera. A year later, Kevin Leyland and colleagues published a paper that was supposed to sort of clarify what exactly the extended evolutionary synthesis is. And here's a diagram, again, from Fabregas, Tejeda, and Vergara Silva, that is supposed to show just how the flow of I don't know what in evolution works. So you have an arrow coming in here, sort of genetic influences. There is genetic change, mutation, gene expression, developmental processes, sort of interaction with the environment, new phenotypic variants. You have bias in the production of variation, niche construction, all kinds of things. Here, processes like selection, drift, mutation pressure, gene flow that modify the frequency of phenotypes in a population, phenotypic evolution, and so forth. So a complicated causal structure of evolution, that's fine. And a sort of an attempt to draw out how these sort of causal influences actually works. So that's great, that's what we should do if we take Darwin serious, as I said. So Darwin's theory was a theory that sprang from the struggle for life of the individual organism. Organism-based, it sort of implicitly included the activity of the organism, etc. So it is sort of trying to come up with a sort of a richer causal structure that a very gene-centered evolutionary theory would have. And so as its central themes, this paper, Leyland et al. In 2015, postulates two sort of aspects which are constructive processes in evolution and what they call reciprocal causation. So let's look at these two sort of themes. Constructive processes, what are they? The authors write, the ability of an organism to shape its own developmental trajectory. So plasticity, by constantly responding to and altering internal and external states. So something like physiological adaptation, but at a developmental scale. So open-ended exploratory evolution springs from this sort of idea of constructive processes. We've talked about the conditions that you need for open-ended exploratory evolution, and they're very complex, and you need a very sophisticated theory of agency in the organization of the organism, as we've seen in previous lectures. So then you have this idea of reciprocal causation, which states that development is not only the product, but also the cause of evolution. So looking at the sources as well as the consequences of evolution and treating them as a serious factor in evolution. Not only does the environment select the organism, but the organism also selects the environment. So you have sort of no strict proximate ultimate distinction. You need to understand development if you want to understand evolution, and you need to understand ecological interactions, which were also a little bit sidelined traditionally in population genetic theory. Okay, so there's nothing to be sort of disagreeing with here. I mean, these are important topics. They're a bit vague, but let's see if we can elaborate on this. So there's a really interesting paper by Andrew Buskell that just came out that is looking at how to judge synthesizing arguments in general in evolutionary theory. And I'm going to use it quite a bit in this lecture. So let's first have a definition. So Andrew writes that synthesizing arguments are attempts to bring about a broad reorganization of concepts, methods, explanatory standards, and structure of evolutionary research. So it's not just sort of about specific topics. It is a sort of a large-scale refocusing, okay? And two major objections are raised within the extended synthesis to motivate this sort of restructuring, okay, against what they call standard evolutionary theory. We'll come back to that in a minute. So one is it's excessive gene centrism. So the privileged role that we assume for genes to explain phenotypes. This whole course has been about a criticism of this, right? So we want to take gene effects, genetic effects serious, but we want to contextualize them in complex systems, networks, and organisms. So, wow, yes, please, more of this. And the other criticism is what Dennis Walsh has called the fractionation of evolutionary theory into different component processes, like inheritance, development, adaptive change, and the introduction of novelties, which are all treated as separate and autonomous from each other, which is something that doesn't, metaphysically just doesn't hold up. So yes, I'm subscribing. That's great. I like it. So these are topics that we need to talk about seriously. These sort of foci, they entrench consensus practice and obscure the visibility of important issues. I also agree. I mean, this whole course has been about that. So issues like developmental plasticity, okay, we haven't treated that very much here. Inclusive inheritance, also haven't talked about this. And niche construction, I've used this as an example. Okay, so we may disagree a little bit about what is really important, but that's more sort of a personal sort of perspective that everybody brings to their research. So let's look at niche construction. Let's revisit that because we've already talked about it and sort of compare how maybe what we could call standard evolutionary theory and the extended synthesis would go on studying this phenomenon. And so an interesting thing is this is a central sort of core example that extended synthesis theoreticians use to say, here, we need an extended synthesis. But if you look at the field of niche construction, most of their models are completely traditional population genetics models that add complexity to the simple models of the field, but don't add any sort of new assumptions or basic principles at all. So why is it that a field that is claimed to be so central to a new focus, that is sort of motivating a new focus in evolutionary biology, why is it that most practitioners in that field are actually using really, really traditional modeling and approaches? So we should, distinguish how people explain niche construction. One, you could call it the fractionated view in Dennis Walsh's framework and say environmental changes happen because there are different gene frequencies. Okay, so the genes are kind of the extended phenotype, what makes the beaver build its dam, right? Or what makes the cuckoo behave in a parasitic way. On the other hand, you could say, okay, the processes, environment and genetic evolution are much more intertwined than usually assumed. And niche construction is both a cause and the result of evolution. And you kind of assume that sort of the environmental, the offspring of the beaver inherit the dam in a way, so that there are two processes here that reciprocally interact and therefore are intertwined. But I mean, this doesn't really help us understand the empirical issues. What is really at play here? How would you get different conclusions from this? And so you have to sort of look a bit more closely, and then you'll find that there are actually two different aims or questions that are involved here that need to be disentangled. One is, a lot of evolutionary biologists ask, how do traits co-vary with the environment? That's an interesting question for any traditional evolutionary biologist or any evolutionary biologist. But the other question is sort of, how do organisms with their activity generate non-genetic heritable variation? Is there something like an environmental variation? You inherit a constructed environment from your parents. How does that affect evolution? So there is the activity of the organism involved. And of course, in sort of an agential view of evolution, this is really interesting, okay? So you need to take the activity, the goal-oriented activity of organisms really serious here. But I mean, this extended view considers that the activity of organisms can alter their environment to ensure a good fit to their niche, and also that these sort of improved conditions are passed on across generations. So basically, the basic insight here is that there are really two perspectives at work here. And the extended perspective really does allow for a wider range of causal factors for evolutionary change. So if we pinpoint specific problems, then it's sort of clear that there are different aims, different questions, and different ontologies at work. Okay, so let's look at that, and let's sort of try and see how a debate about an extended synthesis contributes or obscures the problems at hand. And this is where the issues start. Okay, so niche construction can plausibly be explained by standard approaches. There is no doubt, because most people are using standard population genetics models in this field, but these will fail to uncover all relevant underlying causal processes. So we need to look a bit more broadly. Okay, so this is the debate about gene centrism. And so the debate isn't really about any sort of theoretical synthesis. It's never been, I would say, except for the really early days of the original modern synthesis. But it is about the extent to which genetic mechanisms suffice to explain phenotypes. This is the topic this lecture was all about. And to be honest, it's been the subject of debate for a long, long time in biology, ever since we discovered genes and their influences, really 100 years. This has been an issue. So this debate is not really new. So what is new? Let's explore. And so I have to say that there are some really serious problems with this idea of extending a synthesis. Let me enumerate them to you, and then we'll go through them one by one. So I would count 4 main problems with the extended synthesis idea. One is it doesn't extend anything, okay? The second is it is not a synthesis at all. It doesn't even try. The third problem is it sort of gets close, but still misses the fundamental point of what we should do, in my opinion. And the fourth problem is it is not a theory in any meaningful sense of the term. These are rather serious problems, I think. No extension, no synthesis, no theory, and missing the point. Okay, let's go through them one by one. So this first point, we've been through this sort of snail shell picture here suggests that there is a sort of established core of evolutionary theory, and what we're doing is we're adding on top of it. So are we just, adding to theory? Is this a new paradigm? What's happening? So if you read the original paper by Pilucci in 2007, it's really funny. So he says, wow, it smells of Kuhnian paradigm shift here. And then at the end of the paper, he says, oh, but it isn't, okay? So what's happening is we're just adding stuff on to existing theory. Miller also writes in 2007, the extended synthesis will not replace but complement the modern synthesis. Okay, so we add a bunch of stuff on top of it. As we've seen in the lecture about the modern synthesis, it's already a sort of a very heterogeneous assemblage of different models that don't really add up or to a consistent, coherent theory. And so we just add a bunch of things, outside of the spiral here, we add a bunch of things extra on top of that heap of models. Pilucci and Miller in the 2010 book, right? ESS does not replace but extends the modern synthesis. Okay, all right. But then in 2014 in a Nature paper, Leyland et al., the same authors involved, a lot of the same involved as in the previous publications, they write, oh, we need a rethink of evolutionary theory. And they have an argument there with the sort of people who say they don't. I don't think they win that argument, but it doesn't really matter. So, but a year later, Leyland writes, no, we don't need a revolution. We're just adding continuously to previous research. Here, in private then, Leyland says, okay, the extended synthesis is an alternative research program for evolutionary biology, and this has now also appeared in print. He uses research program in the sense of a philosopher of science called Imre Lakatos. We won't talk in detail about this, but it's a concept from the 70s that depicts a sort of a school of thought on experimentation and whether it's successful or not. And also Gerrit Müller in private conversation says, yes, the extended synthesis is a replacement, not an extension to evolutionary theory. What is it now? Is the revolution happening or not? So one problem is the self-presentation of the extended synthesis is not consistent. So that's, if you want synthesis, you should have sort of a more unified appearance here, I think. So what is their being, extended? They don't seem to know. Is it an extension? Is it a replacement? How does that work? So you could analyze this or interpret this in 2 ways. Either it's a Mott and Bailey strategy. This is a sort of a chicken argumentation strategy where you sort of make a really bold claim in really vague terms and then you chicken out. So you go out into the moat of the castle, you shout something really outrageous in very vague terms, and then when you get criticized, you retreat to the Bailey, the tower of the castle, and you say you never said that, and It's just a continuous sort of expansion of the existing theory. So if this is a revolution, it's sort of a little bit hesitant, maybe. Not really, Che Guevara style. The second, problem may be, interpretation may be that there is a lack of philosophical depth. These people use paradigms, Kuhnian, Lacatosian terms, which are terribly outdated in philosophy of science. Paradigms and research programs are rather worn out notions, right? Fabregas, Tejeda, and Vergara Silva, and they're right. Okay, so maybe it's a lack of philosophical depth or sophistication. The authors don't really quite know yet what this, revolution is going to look like. That's fine. Often we don't know what we're going to do next in science if we have a really profound sort of discovery to make, or we go into really new territory. But then you should maybe be a little bit careful in formulating what you're going to do and how the revolution is going to look like. So overheated rhetoric on both sides, and that's really important. I mean, the sort of against people are also like totally, of course we need to further develop evolutionary theory. This is what science does, it's been developing the whole time, and we have to sort of open it up to different questions. But also the proponents of the EES are sort of making really bold claims, and they oversell the differences between the extended synthesis and consensus practice. So let's look at that. So is it really an extension? What is new? Okay, so the first problem, and we went through this already in the lecture about the modern synthesis, is there is no coherent synthesis to be extended. There's all kinds of different views in evolutionary biology on the genetic evolution side, and also on the extended synthesis side. There's no coherence here. Okay, where is the synthesis? Where is the extension of what? I don't know. So the ES is often sort of blamed for attacking a straw man, and I totally agree. It's there are a few people out there. Jerry Coyne maybe is a walking straw man, but they're not sort of the majority, and there's certainly not a consensus among evolutionary biologists about specific views. It's a very heterogeneous, very diverse field, and that is a good thing, okay? So this sort of snail shell spiral diagram massively oversimplifies the actual structure of evolutionary theory. It's not serious. These sort of diagrams, they're just a bunch of words, basically, in circles. I mean, what do they mean? I don't know. And these type of diagrams also suggest simple connections between fields of inquiry that have no connections between each other, or where existing connections are very complicated, actually, in reality. And so one reason philosophers are really fascinated by this debate, it's really hard to sort of figure out what's actually happening on the ground beyond the rhetoric, okay? So all of the fields of inquiry depicted already exist as independent research disciplines, programs, and questions. And here I need to make a very important point. I love most of the research done in these fields. It's really interesting, and it adds new insights. And a lot of the lecture that I've been giving is based on insights from these fields. A lot of them go into the directions that I think should really be focused on. And so there is nothing wrong with the individual sort of disciplines, but they all would exist equally, perfectly well, doing their stuff if there was no extended evolutionary synthesis at all. Okay, so if that is the case, what the extended synthesis is contributing must lie in the integration of these fields. It's a synthesis, right? So it must contribute by telling us how do these fields synergize to give us a coherent theory of organismal evolution that goes beyond this mythical modern synthesis. The problem is the extended synthesis is no synthesis at all, okay, at all. So you see here, there are a bunch of different fields, and what ecology and, okay, complexity theory, they have something to do with each other. Networks theory, okay, there's all kinds of connections here. But what is the theory? What is that thing that connects everything together? So the problem with this extended synthesis talk is that it's really hard to criticize it, because the arguments, the explicit arguments that are being made are really difficult to articulate. This has something to do with this wishy-washy argumentation, whether it's a revision or not, that's one problem. But it goes further. I mean, there are no theoretical axioms, there's no exceptionless empirical generalizations. It's normal in biology, by the way. There's no canonical set of models. It's a theory very much in flux. And you could say, okay, they're just starting. All right, so but we should at least have some sort of trend towards unification or something, or an attempt at unification. But the problem is that the predominantly qualitative and pictorial representation of theory structure does present exegetical difficulties. This is Andrew Buskell writing, and this is a very nice way of putting it, but you could translate it into saying, you know, what's been published so far is just a bunch of doodles and buzzwords, you know, oh, you know, complexity, and, you know, here we have emergence and, you know, niche construction, and that's it. Is there something more? Where is the meat? Is there meat on the bone? Okay, so Fabregas, Tejeda, and Vergara Silva make this really serious effort of mapping this diagram from Leyland onto sort of questions and real research disciplines. And they say, okay, if there's a structure to this theory, it must be found somewhere between those different planes of the disciplines and the evolutionary theories that we have and the sort of concepts that the EES is referring to. And they do a really careful analysis in their paper, beautiful figures that I've been extensively using here, and they come to a very simple conclusion. And they say the structure of the EES is currently missing. They say it's okay because it's a sort of a new theory, you know, we're working on it, okay? But then they also notice that what is emerging, and that's already quite clear, is a very diffuse network of models, concepts, exemplars, explanation problems, and practices. This is not a unified, consistent theory that's coming up here. It's a bunch of models, stuff, all interesting. So again, I am not criticizing the content or the empirical research done as part of the extended evolutionary synthesis in those different fields. I'm just saying this idea that there has to be an extended synthesis does not contribute anything to the research in those fields. So what about those unifying sort of, you know, themes, constructive processes, reciprocal causation? Buskell, in his paper, notices that these statements are inspired by empirical work, but they are not theoretical statements. They do not function as guidelines for empirical research and are not unambiguous guides to the structure of a reorganized evolutionary theory. They're just too vague to mean anything, really. And this is, you know, another sort of great criticism of the movement by Gaughan and colleagues notices that, you know, they cite Bertalanffy, who said, you know, a collection of facts, be it never so large, no more makes a science than a heap of bricks makes a house. And they write in their paper, the ES has collected lots of bricks in neat piles, but there is no sign of a house yet. That's what they write. I think there is no sign of a house ever coming out of the brickwork here. Okay, so okay, we've got a bunch of interesting stuff. I'm with you. I like that stuff. But why talk about synthesis here? Why? It doesn't make any sense. Okay, so there is no synthesis and there is no emerging synthesis. There's just a diffuse network of different models that exist independently of this talk about synthesis. Okay, so that would be okay. You would think, okay, it doesn't help, but it doesn't do any harm, right? But that's not true. So the next point stresses that sort of this talk, this sort of vacuous talk about a synthesis actually misses the point of what is wrong with evolutionary theory in a rather fundamental way. And remember, when we were talking about the unknown, it's very important to know what the unknown is and where you should be going. So I think this is misleading us in terms of knowing where we should be going and what the important issues are. Okay, so let's look at something that's, for me, rather uncontroversial, the criticism of gene centrism, which the extended synthesis gets right, but it gets it right for all the wrong reasons. And here I'm going to use Rick Gaughan's argument, which is beautiful, and I recommend you read his paper. So he says, you know, there is an obvious target to go after. The extended synthesis could have focused on the excessive genetic reductionism underlying the methodology of developmental genetics. That's what we've done here. Okay, and metaphors such as genetic information and programs, exactly. Okay, so this is where you start criticizing, and you have a good handle because you can show through careful analysis of causality in complex systems, like I've done, how you have to contextualize genetic effects, and that has absolute immediate and important consequences for evolutionary theory that nobody can deny. Okay, but Instead, the extended synthesis, in its mistaken ambition to be a universal synthesis, this really has bad consequences. It chose to spread its effort across a whole range of research topics. Some of them are well established, like developmental plasticity and niche constructions. These are established within standard evolutionary theory. They come out of standard evolutionary theory. Reaction norms, 100 years old. Niche construction, go back to Darwin. Okay, with arguments, they're often vague and ill-defined, so they spread themselves too widely, okay, and often confuse stuff at a very fundamental level. The talk about epigenetics, you know, we encountered epigenetics when we talked about Waddington, but his term epigenetics, he coined it, is often misused today to talk about histone biochemistry and marks on the DNA that are passed on from generation to generation. These marks, they are just as reductionist. They're a way of molecular inheritance. What does that add to a genetic theory? It's just a different chemical means. This is a structural problem, okay? They don't have a different function, probably. They add and modify genetic inheritance on a short scale, maybe. We don't know, okay? But it's not revolutionary, this, okay? And so there is a big confusion between what we talked about, a real, like a reproducer perspective. That's real epigenetics. That's a theory of the life cycle and how you need the reproducer to get genetic replication and inheritance. This is very different, qualitatively different from the arguments here about, you know, some sort of non-genetic inheritance channels, which are not very sort of profound or exciting in my opinion. So the fact that researchers associated with the extended synthesis have set out to supplement the modern synthesis in so many different ways has caused confusion and made it extremely difficult to evaluate the movement's significance. So not only are the arguments all pictorial and sort of buzzwords, but they're also really broad and diffuse. So often the resulting interpretations are just as reductionist as the models they attack. So I just told you that these sort of, you know, models of epigenetic inheritance, they don't really change fundamentally the way we go about studying evolution. But what's totally missing, and this is striking in this extended synthesis, is a serious engagement with the complex and multi-level organization of the organism. Maybe it's coming. I mean, some people are listening to Dennis Walsh. He gets invited to meetings there, but it's certainly not a central sort of, you know, propaganda point in these sort of, you know, big statements about the theory. It's missing from those publications completely. All right, so this is one problem. Then let's look at reciprocal causation, you know. So reciprocal causation is really not new. It's an integrative component of many gene-centric evolutionary models about coevolution arms races, right? Frequency-dependent selections. Eco, that should be eco-devo, so ecological sort of effects on evolution, like niche construction and sexual selection. So, and also, look, here is the perfect book for reciprocal causation, The Dialectical Biologist by Marxist evolutionary biologist Richard Levins and Richard Lewontin. They have a chapter in the book, this is from 1985, by the way, called The Organism as the Subject and Object of Evolution. Beautiful stuff. And much more radical than the extended synthesis. These guys are my intellectual heroes, while Muller and Pigliucci are not, okay? Because the extended synthesis remains firmly stuck in the Newtonian paradigm and doesn't really solve any of the fundamental problems of contemporary evolutionary theory. So it's shallow theorizing, which misses the actual point about dialectical cogeneration, which Levins and Lewontin bring out. And that is the difference, the ontological difference that Walsh stresses between Churchill and Marx. Reciprocal causation between existing independent processes, feedback relations. They fit completely into the Newtonian paradigm, there's no problem. But reciprocal constitution, this dialectical relation of rewriting each other's rules all the time during an interaction, co-generating the rules of the game, that is something that we don't even know how to handle. And the extended synthesis has completely chickened out making any claims in that direction, okay? So what is actually, you know, so revolutionary about it? I don't know. And I think this is the way we should be going. We should take this really serious. We need to take the peculiarities of biological systems serious and go beyond the sort of modeling practices that we've imported from physics to treat them. This should be serious study, but it's nowhere in the extended synthesis. Okay, and let's not forget, and we've been over that when we talked about the modern synthesis, we do not want another synthesis. Seeing evolutionary theory as operating under a shared synthetic framework may even be harmful insofar as it misleads as to the diversity of empirical and theoretical work in the life science and obscures broad scientific trends. It is important to have a huge diversity of perspectives here because we're looking at a huge diversity of phenomena. And for each of those, we should have specific approaches, and we don't need to connect them necessarily. No unification needed. The historical narrative of the grand unifying theory is false. And evolutionary biology does not need a master theory. This claim to synthesis was first made when logical positivism reigned the world, and it's dead. This philosophy is dead today, okay? So the quest for an extended synthesis is completely out of time. It's completely inappropriate. It's a philosophical zombie. It's something that died a long time ago, but hasn't noticed yet, okay? It's the completely wrong thing to do. So which brings me to the last point of criticism, which is that the extended synthesis, of course, is not a theory in any meaningful sense of the term. So you look at this, it's just a bunch of things, okay? So what is a theory supposed to do? I mean, I think there's two main things a theory should do. One is it should unify, formalize, and structure different models, concepts, exemplars, explanations, problems, and practices into a coherent framework. I'm talking about a theory here as a coherent sort of set of models, okay? Otherwise, you can call it models, perspectives, okay? It's fine. I talked about how these things are equivalent, formal models and specific perspectives, they are formalized perspectives. We don't need unification in evolutionary biology or in most of biology. And this idea that unification is a good thing that came from Darwin and the logical positivists is just no longer a thing. And so the problem with the extended synthesis is there is no attempt even. It's not that it's just trying and failing. I don't see an attempt to come up with a unified structure here. That's really, philosophically serious and well-grounded. So no, it's not doing this. The second point, a theory should suggest research avenues for developing new models, concepts, exemplars, explanations, problems, and practices. It generates new research questions, new research fields in the best of cases. This is what they're trying to do. But as I told you, all these things that are part of the extended synthesis, all these fields existed perfectly happily before the extended synthesis came along. They did their thing and they were fine, and they would be fine if the extended synthesis doesn't exist. Nope. Okay, so what is this? Okay, so basically, the extended synthesis is a discussion about gene centrism, which is 100 years or, it's as old as genetics, basically. It's nothing new. So what is it? Okay, it is, rebranding. Rebranding increases sales, attention, it's an exercise in marketing, not in theoretical biology or philosophy of biology. And it works, okay? So it has attracted, it has spawned meetings, a huge grant from the John Templeton Foundation to, work on this because, it's gonna reformulate evolutionary theory. No, it's not, okay? So what it does really is, if you look at it in a positive way for trying, it focuses priorities and funding and other rewards in a research community on particular problems or problem agendas. And I told you, and I'm going to tell you again, I think the questions that it tries to look at are actually really important. I'm just saying it doesn't add anything to them at all. And so what we end up with here is this sort of impression that the extended synthesis is not really about theory, but it's a continuation of politics by other means in the theoretical realm. With apologies to Clausewitz on that. Okay, so basically, we're doing theory for political reasons here. Are we? We are, okay? So there are vacuous pseudo-theoretical debates like the one in Nature. It's just awful to read, I can tell you. It's really, you want both teams to lose in this game, okay? So vacuous pseudo-theoretical debates are used as a smokescreen, I think. So this is my personal impression here. And they are supposed to cover a profound lack in our ability to deal with the complexities of evolution. We haven't done anything. We haven't had much progress because we're not seriously engaging in the questions and we're focusing too much on one perspective. If the ES does anything, it's broadening the horizon a bit away from this genetic perspective. I agree with that. Okay, so it's not all bad in a positive sense. It's an attempt at community building around a common problem agenda, which is basically moving away from this gene centrism, which is a good thing, okay? So if that would be just, okay, let's do other stuff, but it's not. It's an us versus them thing, okay? And it becomes this sort of exclusionary tactic of tribal academic politics, I would call it, academic tribes, you know? We have this word in German that's called Seilschaft, and it's sort of people who climb a mountain together on the same rope. So it's aimed at, just like Ernst Mayr's constriction, evolutionary constriction, it was aimed at keeping funding in and other people out. And, you know, there is a big trend to deplatform people who are dissenting voices. They don't get into the European Evo meeting anymore. They have to open YouTube channels and talk to people that way. You know, so they are excluded from funding as well. This chunk of money that came from the John Templeton Foundation that moved things away great, you know, towards this community greatly. So basically, it's about the politics and the sociology of science, which isn't necessarily a bad thing. But in this case, I think there are two really bad things. One is that it distracts from the real questions. And the other is that we do need a diversity of opinions and approaches, and we should try to work together constructively. I love to interact with people from the ES on their specific topics. I do not like to discuss the extended synthesis. It's a waste of time, okay? But I like their work. So what is really happening here is an agenda that pretends to be about the truth, but it's really just about promoting someone's prestige in science. And this is not an insult, is a philosophical sort of phenomenon that is called bullshit. And we will talk about bullshit in general, and especially in science, in the next lecture. It's a real problem, I think, and we have to have a little excursion into that, because I think the current academic system is producing a lot of bullshit, okay? And it's impeding the progress of science, and it's making it very difficult to take different perspectives, which is exactly what we urgently need, not just in evolutionary biology, by the way, but in all kinds of approaches that humanity has to different scientific topics. It's more important than ever that we have new perspectives, that we collaborate across different perspectives to see the limitations of our own perspectives, and that we step out of this illusion of these simple models that we've built, that are a cartoon version of the reality we live in, and that we start to grapple with the complexity of the reality that we live in through a more perspectivist and collaborative approach. So let's stop these fake debates. And I'm ending this lecture by quoting Bill Wimsatt, who has a great quote at the end of chapter 10, which was originally published in this paper in 1994 of his book, where he talks about perspectives. He writes, "If this explanation for their occurrence is correct or nearly so, an unusually large fraction of the disputes that scientists have should be resolvable, as people from the different groups learn and work out how to talk with one another. If, and it is a big sociological if, they maintain a commitment to try to understand one another rather than bloating their reputations by taking cheap shots at the opposition." This is exactly what's happening in these bloated, vacuous discussions about regulatory evolution and the extended synthesis. This is perhaps the deepest pragmatic commitment of science. That is, that it is in one's interest to come to understand differences and then to resolve them. So I don't want to talk about synthesis anymore. I want to talk about the specific problems that we need to tackle, the tools we need to tackle them. And I want to talk with everyone who is interested in a debate like that, whether they are on this or that side of this fake tribal divide that is being created and that is hampering progress in evolutionary biology today. Thank you very much for listening, and some more bullshit next time.